Of course, let me say thank you to the incredible staff, as always, of the Hilton. Thank you, thank you. You are always so accommodating. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Senator Bill Monning. Senator Monning has long been an advocate for health care and environmental issues. He is Senate Majority Leader and a member of Senate committees on Budget, Health, Judiciary, Legislative Ethics, Natural Resources and Water, and Budget Subcommittee number 3 on Health and Human Services. Welcome, Senator Bill Monning.
Well, thank you, Regina. Let me add my congratulations for your election to the Salinas Valley Memorial Hospital Board. Bravo. I also want to add my thanks to the servers who Regina acknowledged, but to acknowledge they are members of Unite HERE, and one reason we bring our business here is because of the union support at this hotel. So. I also want to add my congratulations to the recently elected Lisa Berkeley and Marina City Council, John Wizard, Seaside City Council, any other newly electeds who we are acknowledging. I acknowledged Regina, but congratulations, and as I say to all people who have just been elected, congratulations and condolences. Now the work begins. I also want to acknowledge my good friend, Vietnam veteran, long-term POW Phil Butler, who was recently recognized by the Monterey County Veterans Association. And Phil has continued to serve as the co-founder and leader of Veterans for Peace, and has turned his horrific war experience into a lifetime committed to peace building. So thank you, Brother Phil, for your leadership. And what I'd like to do before we celebrate some of our shared victories here is just ask for a moment of silence for the fire victims in Northern California, Southern California. If we could just have a moment of silence. Thank you so much. I was in Sacramento yesterday. That air quality was so poor it was like nighttime in the middle of the day. And these fires continue. As Governor Brown had called it, it's the new abnormal. When I was elected to the Assembly in 2008, our fire suppression budget was $50 million a year. Our last budget, it was $950 million, almost $1 billion. In the last 2 years, we've gone into reserves to bridge the gap of budget versus cost. Mark and I also had the privilege of representing the state of California at the Climate Change Conference in San Francisco, hosted by Governor Brown, Mr. Bloomberg, and the state of California. Over 5,000 delegates from over 180 countries, from native indigenous people to heads of state to environmentalists to scientists. And I can tell you, very little of that conference focused on needing to convince people of the reality of climate change. All the panels, all the workshops were focused on solutions and people looking to California for our leadership, but also people pushing California to do more. We've created 500,000 jobs in renewable energy in California. By comparison, there's 50,000 jobs total in oil extraction around the United States. So we are on a path that is working to save our planet, that can also support our economy. So wasn't Tuesday, November 6th, and it's after that? Wonderful. I just want to thank and applaud the leadership of the Women Democrats of Monterey County for your support of so many candidates near and far. the record number of women that have been elected to the House and other local seats. I'm pleased to report that in our California State Senate, we flipped 2 Republican seats, both with Latino women, Ana Caballero and Melissa Hurtado, both in the Central Valley. Red counties, long-term red Senate seats, and we flipped them. And we flipped them with hard work, with phoning, with precinct walking, and the convergence of some of you working on congressional races in the Central Valley, phoning in to some of those races. It all combined for record interim turnout. We did a bus tour of Senate leadership on the weekend prior to the election day. We went to Merced to support Ana, we went to Fresno to support Melissa. We stopped in Bakersfield at a Starbucks, and that stop was by design. We met with about 20 young people who were paid by our Democratic caucus to do voter registration and then to go back and turn out these first-time registered voters. They registered 6,500 new voters in Ana's Senate District 12. And if half of those new registrants voted for Ana, there's the margin right there. But when we met with them in Bakersfield, they'd been deployed south to work in those southern races that we were watching. The lead organizer, a guy named Marshall, wonderful guy, and these 20-something, mostly Latina young people. We stood in a circle outside the Starbucks, and each person introduced themselves as we went around, and they were so enthusiastic about their work. You know, they're getting paid not much more than minimum wage, but so it was a job. But they were absolutely enthusiastic, and there was competition within their group. They came back every day to talk about, to record newly registered, and then later getting out the vote. So that was one of the highlights for us. We then went down to Los Angeles, out to Montebello, where we protected that seat, Senator Archuleta. We went out to Santa Ana, and then out to Palm Springs to support Joy Silver, who fell short to Senator Stone. That even in those races where we fell short, by concentrating resources, we forced those incumbent Republicans to spend money to protect their own seats and not to move the money in our contested fights with Ana and Melissa. So we should be moving to 28 senators, 27 is the supermajority. Mark will share their even better numbers in the Assembly, but that's where we landed in the Senate. So we'll have strong supermajorities in both houses. Gavin Newsom, of course, will come in with an all-Democratic executive branch, and some of those were closely contested races, but even the ones that were in close runoffs, it was Democrat on Democrat for the most part. So we'll come back into session, and swearing in is December 3rd for new members, and then we go back into session in January. So under the stewardship of, well, just acknowledging Jerry Brown's contributions. So 16 years as governor. The last 8, he said he had to come in to undo and fix everything he did wrong the first time. In his old age, I think he did get even more frugal. He left us with a $13 billion reserve in our rainy day fund. About another $2 billion in regular reserves. And then we initiated in our budget planning, we created a new reserve fund under the leadership of our Senate Budget Chair, Holly Mitchell. We reserved $200 million for social service safety net programs, because when the economy dips, and it will dip, we're in the 9th year of recovery. Retrospectively, it's usually never more than 7 years. So there will be a dip. We don't know when, but we know it will come. And the first thing that happens when our economy suffers is more people go on unemployment, more people are dependent on social services programs, particularly single moms with children. So by reserving this $200 million and possibly contributing more to it in the next budget year, we have a little cushion there for the rainy day affecting poor people in the state. So I applaud Holly Mitchell and our colleagues in the Assembly who supported that initiative. I'm going to mention just a couple of bills that particularly affect women. I'm proud of our work on Senate Bill 1129. That looked at the plight in domestic violence cases where a woman wage earner with a pension who's the victim of domestic violence, where the abusing spouse is convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony. Under existing law, she still had to share half of her pension, half of her community property with the abuser. Tony Atkins, who's our relatively new president pro tem of the Senate, had carried a bill based on a case out of San Diego where a victim had been raped by her abuser, and her legislation prevented the requirement of sharing 50% of the community property with a convicted rapist. But then I had two constituents come to me, not the victims of spousal rape, but the victims of horrific abuse, and they were not protected. So we advanced a law, we moved it through the Senate, we faced some resistance in the Assembly, and I want to acknowledge Mark Stone's leadership as chair of Assembly Judiciary. They helped us amend it in a manner that was able to win majority support in the state assembly. It will become the law January 1st in the state of California. We had opposition from both sides. Some of the domestic violence groups, since we require a conviction where the abuser has due process, they said, well, that's too high a standard to require a conviction. And I'm the first to recognize there's cases that don't end up in our criminal courts. But this is at least sets a marker and a standard and a message. We also had resistance from some of the family law bar. It's a no-fault system like workers' comp. You don't prove fault on either side of the ledger in the dissolution of a marriage. But in these circumstances, where you have somebody who's the victim of criminal assault, abusive conduct, it just violated my sense of morality and the people that supported the bill, that somebody should still be able to be a beneficiary of the earnings of the person they victimized. And hopefully this sends a message out loudly and clearly. You abuse your wife, in most cases the abuser is male. Don't count on getting half of the community property from the victim's earnings. So again, I particularly thank Mark and his staff who helped us thread the needle in the Assembly. We also came back to the legislature. I carried legislation 2 sessions ago to require mandatory sexual harassment prevention training for farm workers and for farm worker foremen and supervisors. And that law passed, and it was signed into law. And we know some of the largest incidents of sexual abuse happen to farm worker women and women working in the hotel industry. And Dolores Huerta supported the bill. She came and testified in support. But it was passed, it was signed into law. But the implementation, these farm labor contractors, they just weren't taking it seriously. So California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation came back to us. They said, we've got the law in the books, but they're not following it, and the penalties aren't significant enough. So we went back, we introduced a new bill, and we raised the penalties for farm labor contractors. They can now lose their license if they don't provide the training. They have to do it in a manner that's culturally adapted to the language of the workforce. If there's multi-language, they have to do the training multiple languages. They have to provide the working members of the crew, men and women, with a number of the state labor commissioner and law enforcement outside the purview of the employer. Because one of the problems is if a woman's recourse is to complain to the farm labor contractor or the supervisor, they're often the guilty ones who are the abusers. So it doesn't provide an avenue of recourse. So that, I think, was a significant step forward. Is it actually predated the Me Too movement, and then we got the second bill through that will hopefully raise awareness, raise consciousness, and give victims confidence that there's a place to go to report abuse. And then, of course, the hope in all of these things is that through the education, it serves a preventive purpose as well of reducing the incidence, of putting these guys on notice that there will be consequences if they engage in that conduct. As we move into the next legislative session, I've been working to address the crisis in California that over 1 million Californians don't have access to clean, safe drinking water. I think everyone in this room is familiar with Flint, Michigan, and lead in the water. Our crisis is bigger than that of Flint, Michigan. The contaminants include nitrates, lead, arsenic, uranium, and we've negotiated an agreement that includes agriculture, so-called environmental justice community. In fact, as a former lawyer with UFW, I don't think there was ever a time where the UFW and the Western Growers Association agreed on a piece of legislation. And I'm proud to report that we have that agreement forged and fortified. Over 90 organizations are supporting a solution where agriculture will pay its fair share. Ag is responsible for about 30% of the contaminants from nitrates and dairy. 70% are naturally occurring. And in drought conditions, groundwater tables get more strained and they leach more contaminants. So the arsenic, the lead. So Ag has said to us as a partner, we're willing to pay our fair share, but we only account for about 30% of it. So we're not going to pay 100% of the bill. So part of our bill goes to ratepayers and addresses this as a human rights crisis for our entire state. And we ask all ratepayers to pay 90 cents per month on their water bill with an exemption for people living under the poverty line. They don't pay the 90 cents. But we faced resistance from water districts, understandably. Nobody likes to pay a tax. But if you look at this as a human rights crisis, this affects Watsonville, Salinas Valley, Carmel Valley, the entire state. It's not just the Central Valley. It's all over the state of California. What these communities have in common, they tend to be small number of ratepayers. A small district, 200 ratepayers, 500, 1,000. They can't raise rates high enough among a poor community to get a treatment facility or to build a pipeline to link to a safe water system. Our bill would allow for all of that. Link to a safe water system, build a treatment facility with the objective of getting clean, safe drinking water as a fundamental human right. There are families who can't drink the water, they can't bathe with it, and they can't cook with it, and they're still getting a water bill every month that they have to pay. So in my view, it's criminal. It violates fundamental standards of human rights, and the state of California has acknowledged the right to clean, safe drinking water as a human right. We're the first of 50 states to acknowledge the right. Our job now is to implement it. So we will keep you posted on that. I'm going to defer back to your president, Regina, and I just want to close by acknowledging my good friend and colleague, Mark Stone. We've worked well together, Assembly and Senate, representing our shared districts in the Central Coast. And I can tell you, it makes a difference to have friends and allies in both houses. We can set agendas, we can go out and get the job done, but we can't do any of it without standing on your shoulders. We are so fortunate to represent a progressive district that lets us show our true colors and fight for progressive legislation. So again, thank you for all you do, and congratulations.
Thank you, Senator Monning, as always. Oh, I think I need my sheet from you so I can properly introduce Assemblymember Stone. I'm sorry I didn't.
Just trying to clean up my mess.
Oh, clean up. I'm sorry I didn't memorize it. So it is my pleasure to introduce Assemblymember Mark Stone. Assemblymember Stone provides leadership on environmental protection, child welfare, and public safety. He serves as chair of the Assembly Judiciary Committee and is a member of committees on natural resources, human services, budget subcommittee number 5 on public safety, and banking and finance. Stone has earned his reputation as a leader in helping California's most vulnerable residents. Welcome. Thank you.
I was just threatened with the glare. 10 or 15 minutes and then you'll get the glare. So I know we have time and we'll get to that. So just sort of talking about highlights and things that have gone on in the legislative session. So we did went through an interesting election cycle, and I know a lot of you, and thank you, were working outside of this area. And what Bill says is absolutely true. We know you have our backs. In fact, we know you drive us to better policies than a lot of our colleagues would be able to do. So we get to be kind of out ahead on a lot of things because of your expectations and your support. And we cannot underscore how important that is. And in fact, I think I'm the first Assembly member in a long time who's had a Democratic state senator where we interact and overlap. It's been a long time for that. And being able to share house to house some of the policies is really critically important and good for the Central Coast so that we don't get left behind as the state's figuring out how to craft bond money and send resources here and there throughout the state. But that work that I know you all did across the state, Central Valley, Southern California, I was in Orange County a couple of weeks ago, and we get, because we have strength in our district, our leadership always asks us to write checks to help out some of our colleagues around the state. And those are never fun calls to get. But a couple of months ago, less than that, we were told that there were 2 or 3 seats, assembly seats, in play that were not in play because of this push for flipping Congress. And so the down ballot effect was all based on turnout, and we saw that turnout. So we now have, this session, which is not quite over yet, we're not in session, but we'll wrap up in a month or so. We had 55 Democrats, 54 is the supermajority, and we can talk long about the supermajority and the effect of that, but we could end up with 60 Democrats in the Assembly. Which is significant, and I'm hoping some of that will help ameliorate the challenges we have with the supermajority, because there are a lot of Democrats who you would not recognize as Democrats who are in Congress, and it makes it a real challenge to get things passed that you are expecting us to get passed. With 60, that gives us a little bit more wiggle room, and I've met a number of them, and they're going to be in tough seats where they had traditionally been a Republican, now it's a Democrat. And they're going to have to be strategic in how they hold on to that seat, but yet they're cut more from your mold than some of the others. And so the possibilities here are pretty exciting. And we're getting rid of a couple of Republicans, and there are a number of Republicans that I work with in my house quite regularly who are actually very helpful and want to be engaged and are productive. There are a number who I don't know why they have their seat other than just to make a lot of noise, and they do, one of whom will not be with us next year. And that's why when the speaker said, we think we can challenge this one, I was all in. Okay, fine, I will write that check, absolutely no problem. Because there are helpful people in the legislature, not so helpful people in the legislature, and the more folks we have, regardless of their party, who are willing to engage and willing to govern, then the better California is. And that's really what we're heading into with some folks who are there for a reason, and that reason is governance and moving California really into our next steps. And what are those next steps? Part of that, I have no idea. I'll explain that in a minute. Part of it we've watched the federal government back off, deny climate change, back away from their responsibilities in the education scenario, back away from all kinds of other commitments to the American people. And California has been very willing to step up and try and fill some of those gaps. So what Bill mentioned with the Climate Action Summit, and we were able to do that. California was able to do that because of the feds sort of backing off. And Jerry Brown said, we'll do one here. And this was the Climate Action Summit because if you wanted a seat at the table at the summit. If you wanted to be on the platform, you had to, you meaning a representative of governments around this world and states across this nation, you had to come with what your commitment is to remediating climate change, whether it's mitigating emissions or adapting to the changes that are coming. In fact, California led with an ocean acidification task force, where it started with the 3 western states, added Hawaii, added a number of other states. Now there are a couple of dozen jurisdictions from Fiji to Sweden to all around the world who are committed, because we cannot solve the ocean challenges and the changing in those chemistries because of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that the oceans absorb, which is what it's designed to do. We can't solve that on our own. We have to have partners around the world. We now have more partners than we ever had before. And countries that are committed, other than the United States, to helping out and to being at the table and being a part of any solution. That's why this was so significant. This was California as a subnational jurisdiction stepping up in a way that our country's not doing. And the rest of the world is looking for that leadership. And the message was pretty clear. California, you're known for exporting innovation. We are. But what they wanted to do is export leadership by passing tough laws, which we've done, and by showing the way in a lot of different areas. And that's what that summit was about. So shift a little bit to the budget. Bill talked a little bit about sort of where our budget is. The reality is we have more in reserve in California than I think it is 38 states have in their general funds. So that sounds good, but as we head towards an economic downturn, the other thing that you all know very well and that we cannot forget, parts of California are doing very well. Parts of California are not doing very well. We've seen huge growth in corporate profits, huge growth in executive salaries. The wage gap has never been higher, and we have stagnating wages across the board. So not only are we seeing growth in our economy, and we've been able to invest more in the poorest of Californians, because that economy is doing so well, we should not be having to make those investments if more companies were taking responsibility for their employees and providing them benefits. A company that's making the money that a lot of these corporations, major corporations are, and their employees are still on public benefits, makes absolutely no sense. So as we go into a downturn, depending on what that looks like, we will have then even more relying on public coffers. And those who hate that, fine, you can rail against public entitlements. What else are these people going to do? And they have every right, as the rest of us do, to benefit in the recovery as we see in the growth. And even in Silicon Valley, there are the haves and there are the have-nots, which is why people commute 4 hours a day to get to a job because they can't afford to live there. The service workers there are not making enough money to be able to live where they work. They're not seeing the growth and the benefit and the salaries or the benefits that others are. So the economy is really good news, but we have to talk about the undercurrent there as well, if we're going to be honest about benefits across California. And we are really trying to, and even though Brown has been very tight-fisted, as is his reputation and as is appropriate, and we've really, I think, ended up with a very good interplay between the executive and the legislative around the budget. Because he starts every year, you've probably seen it, oh my gosh, we've got deficits this year, oh my gosh, we're going into the recession. Last couple of years he's tried that, turns out there's more money now than we thought there was 3 months ago even. But he's setting the stage to make sure that when we're pushing for money, because we're the legislature, and that's what we do, that we're negotiating something that looks like investment. So we've put a lot of one-time money in the budget, that's good. But we've also invested in schools, we've invested in the earned income tax credit, we've invested in some of the poorest Californians, because those can be seen as investments that have ultimately a payoff. Brown has been much more interested in that. So the big question, I think we understand where Newsom wants to put some of his priorities: healthcare, early childhood education in general. And the early childhood education has been something we've been trying for a long time with Governor Brown. I don't think he was ever a kid. He hasn't quite met some of these pieces, and that's fine. But Newsom does. Newsom does. So we're going to be able to see, I think, some changes in perspective and growth in support for our youngest children and support for those families who are struggling to raise those youngest children. And Jerry's been fabulous on a lot of the changes we've been involved with, trying to change the justice system, both juvenile justice and adult justice, to be more rational, more humane, stop this school to prison pipeline that we've developed in California, stop the investment, because if we can actually start to close prisons and cut down some of those beds, that's money that could and should have gone into higher education and can go back into higher education. So there are some really positive benefits that I think Newsom's going to be, but the big question is, a lot of this depends on who he puts in as his cabinet. And that's a question we get all the time. Who's going to be secretary of this and secretary of that? I don't know. And history shows that the first people who, the names that come up first typically will never get it because everybody's sort of trying to have no idea, but it's going to depend on Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Natural Resources, all of those Secretary of Environmental Protection, and what they're interested in, to see then how the policies we've been working on over the last number of years will dovetail with what this governor is expecting. This is the first time in a generation that it's been a Democrat following a Democrat. And as Newsom points out, he's the first Democrat in Lord knows how long that's not either a Brown or a Brown staffer or somebody tied in with the family tightly. So he has this sense of new beginnings and a new start. And it's going to be a very interesting, at least first year, especially as we figure out who the important people are going to be put into what place, and then what that means for us as we try and implement. But the direction, I think, is pretty clear. We're going to stay the same course. The details will have to work out, and as we do policy, of course, the details is what make me pull my hair out or not as we go through the year. But in general, California is healthy, California is strong, and if we've really designed the budgets the way that we think we have, as we do go into those downturns, we're not going to be taking from counties and cities and really hurting the implementation, because it's the local jurisdictions that implement the programs, and that's really where a lot of the constituent services happen. That's where the connections are. And when the state general fund goes into deficit, into challenges, we end up taking away from a lot of local governments and their ability to function. That's what we're trying to guard against as we go into this administration and sort of next changes in sort of economic cycles. But I'm always an optimist and pretty optimistic about the kinds of things that we're going to be able to do. And it should be a good next couple of years. And I appreciate all of your support. This is a room full of very friendly faces. It's nice to come in and talk to people and kind of connect with what you're interested in. And I absolutely appreciate that, but I think Bill and I both appreciate the push that we get from you. And just as an example, I ran a bill last year to try and leash bottle caps on single-use plastic bottles. And I got a lot of pushback, of course, from the soda industry. Oh, Lord. And that was it. But the single biggest complaint I got out of the district, people did not like that bill. Yeah, and the reason is what are you doing with bottle caps? Just ban single-use plastic bottles. Yeah, okay, I get that. We can talk about that here. In fact, the soda industry used that argument against me to get votes against the bill. It's, well, you know what Stone wants to do. Stone just wants to ban single-use plastic bottles. And I'd have to tell them, yeah. But that's not what this bill is about. So they use that to help kill the leash the lid concept. But that's what I love about the district that Bill and I share here, was people were thinking even further. Okay, leash the lid, fine. Why don't you just ban single-use plastic bottles? That's the real problem. Now, easier said than done in this legislature. But you have to recognize a step in the right direction. And that was not successful, but we've actually done a lot of education around it. It's like a cigarette butt bill, done a lot of education around truth, impact, and detriment. And that's productive, and sometimes we have to look at this as a long game. So thank you all very much. Thank you for having us here, and I know we're on tap for questions. Yeah. So what would you like to know?
I have two questions. The first question is, we're living in the middle of the state, and we have these horrendous fires up north and down south. and there's a 30-acre parcel of land for sale in Carmel Valley Village. And the state has a surplus. Can't you come up with $3 million to help us buy that piece of land and keep us safe?
The interesting thing about that is the big ticket items, talk about 100 billion here and 100 billion there, that's easy, we've settled on those. What we fight over is 3 million, 100,000, and all of that. So you'd think that would be easy. It's a little bit of a tougher ask than that. And I know that the thought is to, out of the CAL FIRE budget and all, to help because it's a good staging area. And keeping that land in public access is a really, really good thing. So I think we can look at that going into this next year. It's not something that necessarily fits into CAL FIRE's budget. And one thing I will say about the fires that most people don't understand. Last year, 2017, we were literally one fire away from having no ability to respond. And it wasn't money, it was equipment and men and women on the line. We were literally at the end. If there was one more fire, I don't know what we would have done. We were that close. Now, 2018, everybody thought it was a bit of a respite. Turns out, no. So we're having to rethink what this all means and what the investments are. And we finally got in the Senate Bill 901 the ability to pre-position and do some investment in some of that equipment and some of the training for firefighters, which will help us be able to respond to a fire as it develops instead of having to wait till it is such a big conflagration that it's much more difficult to do. So money is kind of difficult in that question, and you'd think $3 million, but the smaller the amount, the harder the battle.
Well, don't forget us. The second
No,
question
absolutely not.
is the PUC. It seems to me several years ago they had a spine. And I don't know, it seems to me now they've lost their spine. And if they prove that the fire up north was caused by PG&E, it seems to me that they should get their spine back.
Well, I don't know about PG&E and their spine. But recognize that, and those people that work with the PUC,
The public utilities.
the public, yeah. But the Public Utilities Commission is not the Public Utilities Commission. It's the Public Utilities Commission. What does that mean? It means they are more swayed by those utilities that are the public utilities, the investor-owned utilities, that's who they have jurisdiction over. They're more swayed by them than by you. And we've had, over this last year, a huge fight with investor-owned utilities, PG&E being responsible, being not responsible. The scary part about this is their potential for liability right now is 3 or 4 times their market cap. So they're going to be out of money, and okay, I'm not sure how much sympathy I have for them, especially the way that they've been acting lately. But the reality is we need to make sure that we have the utilities and that ratepayers are being treated fairly in all of this. So as we go back into session, there are a lot of very difficult questions the legislature is going to have to answer. We started that process last year and did not capitulate, fortunately, to everything the PG&E wanted because that was not appropriate. But we're going to have to figure out how we make sure people can recover from these devastating fires and that we still have a responsible investor-owned utility that's providing electricity and doing everything that they can, which is what they have not been doing, to make sure that their systems are resilient enough and not causing or adding to the fires. So that's going to be a long, ongoing conversation that we're going to have to end. I'm not sure what the answers are going to be. I don't know, Bill, if you wanted to weigh in on that. There's a lot of risk there.
I thought on the first question you were wanting to offer that land for the displaced from Butte County, but on a serious note, 6,000 families have lost their homes. There's no housing stock in Butte County. The schools burned. They're talking about after Thanksgiving, busing schools to other counties to integrate them into operational schools. The devastation from this is hard to fathom, and I think all of our communities are going to have to figure out how we step up in a humanitarian fashion to help the victims.
I just wonder whether you could give a quick summary of successful environmental bills that would become big effect January 1, if there are any.
That's actually, unfortunately, fairly thin. At the macro level, we did things like commitment to 100% renewables. We're starting to up the ante with how we're managing the electric grid. And because of cap and trade, which was a bit of a mixed bag, but even still, because of some of that money now can be spent on adaptation, and we're going to be using some of that money to help with forestry issues, to help mitigate some of the fire. So we've done some of that. At the more macro level, the kinds of things like reducing plastic in the ocean, addressing some of the water quality issues have been a real challenge, things that are difficult in the legislature. Those did not really fare so well over the last 2-year session, and we're hoping that that's going to change. But at the highest level, on the highest stage, where we really did make strides were in the climate change arena.
And what is the status of the 100% renewable by when?
It's 100% by 2045. And there's different ones, different states, different jurisdictions have done things, so it's 100% renewable by 2045. In that bill, there's not a plan to get there, so there's a lot of work around there. We have a lot of electrical infrastructure, vehicle charging stations. We tried to build last year that would have required by 2030 or 2035 that all new vehicles in the state sold were electric or some kind of renewable fuel. That didn't go very well, but it was a good start to the question and the statement. And more car manufacturers are doing electric vehicles. We're trying to solve the electric, large-scale, heavy trucks and buses, which is a little more difficult to solve. So we've been putting in priorities and policies to drive those questions that will lead us to the 100%.
Thank you. And I would just add, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of passing SB 100. That was a huge fight. The oil companies went to the mat to try to defeat it. One of the co-authors, Senator Kevin De Leon, who's termed out. His leadership, we failed on it last year. This year we got it to the governor, and the governor signed it right before the climate summit conference. It's instructive not just to shaping our policies, energy policies moving forward in California. It serves as a beacon and a model to other states and other countries. And let me just mention, at your tables, you should have a handout of, this is my legislation over the last 2 years, and on the environmental front, some of these aren't headline grabbers, but I think they're important. My Senate Bill 377 aligned state policy with federal for lead abatement in homes, for remodel, destruction, construction. It's the #1 public health hazard to children. And this puts us in alignment with other states who are making it easier for contractors to get the certification necessary to do lead removal that meets federal and state standards. We talked about the water bill. I believe that's an environmental issue as well. Mark supported me on our Senate Bill 1079 for the fire safe councils. They're nonprofits that exist. They get money, but the system had been to clear brush and timber and dead trees. But the way they worked, it was on a reimbursement system. And as small nonprofits in communities, they couldn't advance the money to do the work. So this bill allows for them to do the work and get reimbursed, or get the money up front from the state to do the work. Once the projects are defined, they can get the money up front so they can contract to get the work done. That's going to have a significant impact throughout the state in all 58 counties. And Mark was talking about plastic bottles and the leashes. I co-authored the Senate Resolution 139 that makes this month, November, straw-free November. And our critics say, why are you focusing on straws? Why are you focusing on plastic straws? Yes, here's an example of metal. Carmel City Council passed a no plastic straw. Cardboard straws work just fine. But this resolution was brought to us by a young woman who founded the Junior Ocean Champions with the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Her Her name's Shelby O'Neill. She's a Girl Scout from Hollister, and she got a merit badge developing this No Straw November. She's since gotten Delta Airlines and Alaska Airlines to get rid of plastic straws. Showing what one person can do. And all you have to do is see a photo of a sea mammal, a turtle, with a belly full of plastic, and you realize that it's something that we as humans are causing. We as humans can make a difference. Yes, other questions?
Well, I just want to add something, going back to the political stuff about elections. One thing to put on your radar, there was a Dem-on-Dem race in the Senate, and the person who won, who's going to be the next senator out of there, won because of literally millions and millions of oil dollars that were put in to influence that election. So the oil industry pushed back on SB 100, pushes back on fracking bans, on a lot of the things we've been trying to do. This is how they are successful, because they fund candidates, Democratic candidates in the legislature. So that's just something to pay attention to.
And that's where, as Mark alluded earlier, to the 2/3 supermajority can be misleading. So I think one of the worst reforms that was passed by voters in the state was the top 2 runoff. This is a prime example. We had a long-time progressive, labor-supported candidate who was leading all the time. Chevron came in with over $3 million in independent expenditure and boosted his opponent over the line. She'll be joining us in the Senate in January. And when we come to climate change issues, cap and trade, etc., she's going to be beholden to this big money interest.
Can that change?
Only the voters would have to.
Is that likely to happen?
Not likely. It's sold as getting rid of the extremes, bringing people to the middle, but the corporate class has figured out how to play that game in spades. Yes?
Going back to the plastic, can California take the lead in trying to solve the huge plastic gyre in the Pacific?
So the question is about the huge plastic gyre in the Pacific. Can California do something? Mark may have some comments on this too, but there are some scientists who are developing strategies for reducing that. There were some scientists up at the Long Marine Lab who were figuring out how to feed the captured plastic and reconvert it to fuel, because it's an oil base, to power the ships that would clean it up, kind of a perpetual motion idea. It sounds great. I don't think they've perfected it yet, but that would be a way to go.
Well, the challenge with that is there's a lot of mythology around what it is. This island the size of Texas that's floating out there. Were that only true, because that's something you can think about cleaning up. The problem is it's very, very insidious. It's very small bits of plastic in the surface film from here to Japan. And the most amount of volume they think is in the North Pacific, but that is replicated in every major ocean around the world. And it does float, it does sink, it changes, but what we're ending up with is a layer on the bottom of the ocean, more and more that's plastic. A million years from now, somebody's going to find this plasticine layer on the wood and wonder what the heck that was. The only real way to stop that is to stop the inputs, and that's what we've been struggling with, is to find ways to reduce single-use plastics in the economy, how they're used everywhere, and stop that input into our waste stream, missing the waste stream, and out into the oceans.
How can and how will the state of California respond to the federal government's response to immigration as a caravan?
The question is, how can California respond to the federal government's immigration policy, the response to the caravan, etc.? I'm going to start with an answer. I'm going to lead with a joke. I was going to lead off with this afternoon, but this is the appropriate moment. So, a liar, a narcissist, and a con man walk into a bar. The bartender says, "What do you have, Mr. President?" That's our challenge. And I don't make light of the reality of what we're facing. I'm proud to say California is engaged in over 40 lawsuits. Either we're suing the federal government or they're suing us. Javier Becerra, who was recently elected, he'd been appointed, now elected to a full term, has been providing leadership. Both our houses in the legislature, we passed Senate Bill 45 that just affirmed existing law. They said we created a sanctuary state. We really didn't. We just said enforcement of federal immigration law under the Constitution is appropriately and necessarily carried out by federal officers, not by local police, not by local sheriffs. And that's been embraced to differing degrees in different parts of the state. If you recognize in our district, the district I represent, the leading employer is agriculture. Number 2 is hospitality tourism. And number 3 is higher education. The first two, the backbone of those two industries is immigrant workers. They pay taxes, they pay property taxes through rent, they pay income taxes. Every paycheck they get has federal tax and state tax withheld. It's taxation without representation in many cases. And increasingly, the federal government, the Trump administration, is now targeting people who seek to adjust status from a green card to citizenship and expanding what's considered a public charge. If your citizen children got food stamps, if you as a pregnant woman got prenatal care as an undocumented worker, which helps our public health to not have that delivery in an emergency room with a deformed child that we as taxpayers then will care for. Just the word of them pursuing that rule change, and it's ticking. You can comment till December 1st on the public charge proposed rule change. I'd encourage you to go on there and oppose it. This all ties into the bigger immigration challenge. My view is that a responsible administration would have convened a summit with the governments of Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and figured out a humanitarian response. Mexico has been affording these migrants coming from Honduras temporary status. They've provided humanitarian support, food, medical care, etc. But many are still intent on exercising their right under U.S. federal law to apply for political asylum and to have that application considered. What the Trump administration is saying in sessions before he left is, we think too many people are taking advantage of our political asylum laws, so we're just going to suspend it and cancel it. They are the lawbreakers, not people fleeing from violence, not people fleeing to get food for their children. This so-called caravan of invaders, you just look at the pictures. These are men, women, and children who are on the brink. We should be providing a humanitarian response, not a military response. And just on that thought, the grandstanding of Trump sending 15,000 troops to the border before the elections, troops who now won't be with their families for Thanksgiving, a fraction of the budget that's sending them to the border could provide all these families in the caravan with a home and some property in a little ranchito in Mexico.
Well, I'll say, when we had the crisis of the unaccompanied minors, California put money on the table to get them legal services and help to integrate. We will be, I'm sure, responding in kind, but we shouldn't have to do that if we had legitimate federal policy. And if we spent a fraction of what they're talking about on the damn wall and went to these countries, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the others, and helped them with their internal security issues, crime, all of that, we could spend a fraction, they wouldn't be caravanning to try and get here. There's an easy answer, it's just they're unwilling to do it. So it's a federal issue ultimately. Now that we have Congress back being blue, hopefully they'll have a little bit more ability to put pressure on the administration. We'll do what we can, but there's not much we can do other than try and find ways to help those people once they get here. And we will.
When you look at places like Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, Honduras, they're breeding grounds for terrorist recruitment. You have desperate people. So we don't hear about that economic base. Yes, they're desperate people and we should help them, but we're also screwing ourselves more by not helping them get the caravan.
Well, that's what I mean. The caravan wouldn't be there if we were working. If we helped them with their internal policies, which we could do, and invested in those countries in a productive way, with education, with health care, with the kinds of things that those people help them create safer communities there, the caravan wouldn't be there. That's what they, well,
Yeah, if I could-
Donald Duck doesn't seem to.
If I could just offer a final comment on that. The dumbing down of our media, the loss of daily print media, the excesses on the internet. How many stories have you seen about the caravan that go back in history to the 1970s and 80s when our government supported ruthless regimes in El Salvador alone, a country of 3 million people in 1980, over 1 million fled the country in the early 80s. 1/3 of the country fled the violence. The planes were provided by us, the napalm was provided by us, the M16s were provided by us, and the massacres have been well documented. So those million that fled, a lot of them ended up in California and the East Coast. Some ended up in our criminal justice system. When they did their time, they got introduced to the gangs in our prisons. They did their time and they were automatic candidates for deportation. So they gained in our country knowledge and affiliation with the gangs, and they took it back home, where they had a ready supply of M16s and weapons of war that have now been incorporated into the gang culture there. So we can't forget the history, we can't repeat the history, and so much of the hocus pocus of the Trump tweeting and all of that. There's a war going on in South Yemen right now where we're providing the weaponry that is engaged in wholesale massacres of civilian populations. When was the last time you saw a story on that in any of our papers? We need to rise up. Maybe this new Congress can focus on our foreign policy. Chris, you had a question.
It's a completely different topic, but one I'm wondering whether the Assembly or the legislature, the state legislature, are dealing with, and that's the whole issue of the crisis in housing, affordable housing, that's been exacerbated by the whole short-term rental syndrome. And we see cities across the state all trying to do local ordinances to deal with it, and they vary. And I'm just wondering if you looked at that as a larger problem and issue throughout the state as a way of
Yeah, so
getting some of that housing.
the question is affordable housing, the impact of short-term rentals. I know Mark will have some thoughts on this as well. It's front and center, the number one issue in my district when I meet with every city council, housing and water, water and housing. Traditionally, the state has not involved itself in housing. It's private sector that's relied upon. In these last couple sessions, we've passed tens of bills, including putting bond measures that some of you passed last Tuesday on the ballot, providing repurposing of Mental Health Services Act money for homeless investment, learning that from a medical point of view, a homeless person who has a diagnosis of mental illness, you get them services by getting them a place, and then you qualify them for Medi-Cal, etc. But the spectrum goes from homeless to workforce. Workforce that used to be able to rent a home for their family in Big Sur, they're now all commuting from Watsonville, Salinas, Castroville to jobs in Big Sur, because the homes down there are all being rented for weekends, more on a weekend than you could rent it for a month. And we see that in our communities. Pacific Grove just voted on the issue. In terms of what the state can continue to do, I think Newsom has said it's a priority for him. In San Francisco, they just passed a local ordinance requiring the companies to contribute part of their revenues to addressing housing in San Francisco. That may be a model for other parts of the state or for state legislation. A group is working to qualify a bill for the ballot to amend Prop 13 to restore some of the tax increment for our schools. Maybe some of that could be envisioned. It's going to generate billions if we can pass it to the housing challenge. But there's no magic wand. The state doesn't have a magic wand. One of my colleagues in the Senate, Bob Wajkowski, authored legislation that relaxes some of the constraints on people building a granny unit or an auxiliary unit on their property. that's not the solution, but every little piece can provide some relief. And Mark, you probably have some thoughts on it.
Yeah, and when I was on the board of supervisors in Santa Cruz County, we dealt with this and created a vacation rental ordinance to try and minimize the impacts in some of the communities there, and it's turned out to work pretty well. Was not uncontroversial, but the real challenge here is the state has not typically weighed in on local land use decisions. We have left that traditionally to cities and counties because that's how cities and counties are structured. But there's a growing frustration in the legislature, and this is where some of this comes, some of it well-intended, some of it more of a challenge for local jurisdictions, that some jurisdictions are not taking responsibility for the housing issues that they have. And great example with a lot of population and big impact, City of San Jose is doing a very good job building housing. Surrounding cities are not, and the San Jose is getting a little frustrated that they're the ones providing all of the housing for the workforce and for others who are there, and the other cities are just saying, not here, not here. That's traditionally been prerogative of local governments. So the more that we see that, the more the legislature is going to want to weigh in and do something. We're not always creating the best solutions, and some of the solutions will work well in a very highly urbanized area, not so well in a more rural area. And so far, some of those proposed bills have been almost one size fits all, which would be to the detriment of our area if we're not careful. So that's where we have to be very careful about it. But the more, and this is what I tell cities and counties that come to talk to me, oh my gosh, we're not going to see that again. I say, yeah, you probably will. But the challenge is if we can make the case for a city or a county to not be imposed upon, they are going to have to show how they are working to solve the underlying problem. And the underlying problem really is, again, the 9 Bay Area counties, which we're tangentially connected to, if you will, they're doing a better job meeting the growth needs. And they always measure it as 30%, 40%, 50, 60% of the new demand that they're building for. What they don't say is that they're starting in Bay Area, those 9 Bay Area counties, with 1 million units of housing deficit. So they're only talking about the gap between starting with that $1 million and up. If you spread 1 million units over the 9 Bay Area counties, minimal impact. But because they're sort of being focused into certain areas, lots of local impact. So this is a tough one. So local jurisdictions are trying to address the vacation rental ordinances. They're trying to hold on to some of their own needs and based on what the local politics are, but I think everybody needs to take a hard look at what the needs are, what the carrying capacity is, what the resource limitations are, and make decisions within that context. And if you can do that, then I'm hoping we're not going to see this oppressive kind of state overlay into an area that was traditionally local.
Yeah, just a quick question on your bill for clean drinking water.
Yes.
You mentioned that water companies need to sign off on that. Is CalAm involved for local area?
So CalAm is part of an association of private water companies.
Oh, we know that.
Right. That association actually they stood down. They did not oppose my bill. The Association of Public Water Agencies, AQUA, opposed my legislation. So we're going to keep working with them. You have a big district in LA, East Bay Mud, etc. They say, why should our ratepayers help somebody out in the Central Valley or Watsonville? I have the response to that because it's the right thing to do and there's nowhere else to go. And 90 cents a month with an exemption for people living under the poverty line is not too much to pay to address this challenge. I think you said we need one more question, so over here.
Maybe go a little step further on the water thing. When the whole flood crisis was going on, I heard a lot about old pipes. Is that an issue? Do we have these communities with very old homes right around here? Are the pipes potentially an issue?
Yes, so the question is, are the pipes an issue? The quality of pipes, old construction using lead, a problem in Flint, Michigan, in part, although there's a deeper story in Flint, Michigan about how the governor tried to privatize and give industry the clean water from the lakes and let the poor communities get dirty water. So I don't have a good enough barometer. I think there are health and safety requirements that monitor the quality of the water for different particulates, including lead. If we can trust those people that are doing the monitoring.
Galvanized related to lead at all?
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. I do want to just also close. Nobody asked a question about gun violence or gun regulation. We suffered another horrific tragedy that's been somewhat eclipsed now by the fire in Southern California. My colleague, Henry Stern, the senator who represents Thousand Oaks and Malibu, had left with some Senate colleagues on a delegation to India, a trade delegation, which is not a junket we pay out of our own pocket when we go on a trip, unlike Congress. There's no taxpayer money involved. Henry landed after a 14-hour flight, learned of the shooting, didn't leave the airport, found another flight back, and while he was flying back, learned of the fire as well. So Bradley Zeeb wrote a very thoughtful piece, I think it was in last week's Weekly, raising questions, concerns, his family's connection with the shooting in Pittsburgh and at the Temple. This is a public health epidemic. Hopefully the new Congress, the new House, can restore funding to the CDC to study this crisis as a public health crisis. A lot of the recommendations you read, we've already enacted into law in California. We have some of the toughest gun laws, including one that my colleague Hannah Beth Jackson led after the shooting at UC Santa Barbara, where somebody who is known to have mental instability, a family member or law enforcement can go to court now and get an injunction that allows law enforcement to remove weapons from their possession. We faced, as you can imagine, tremendous resistance on that, not just Second Amendment, but who gets to put the finger on a family member or somebody that they've got a dispute with or something like that. I think we err on the side of public safety. Law enforcement and the court are not going to exercise this mildly. You will have to make a showing that there's a threat proposed. But as you can see in our local area, you read in the papers about restraining orders being issued against people. This current occupant of the White House has given rise to the most dramatic rise of these white supremacist organizations and just lone nuts who get set off by the rhetoric, and most of the bark is bark only, but we have far too many examples of the bark being followed by a bite or no warning, and there they are. So that will continue to be a priority. I know it's a priority for Governor Newsom, Governor-elect Newsom, and I don't think there's any next step that we won't consider seriously if it makes our communities safer, and that should be our responsibility to protect the health and safety of all Californians. But we're becoming desensitized. These incidents are happening with such regularity. It's the headlines in CNN for, it used to be days, now it's hours before they move on to something else. It's got to stop. So sorry to end on that sad note, but thank you.
Senator Monning and Assemblymember Stone, we can't thank you enough for, of course, always being accessible to us, but also just being so compassionate and authentic and doing the right thing. I mean, isn't that a radical concept? So, thank you both. Thank you both. I mean, I hear there's going to be an open job in, 2 years in Washington, Senator Monning. Have you given it any thought? I mean, what's the worst that can happen? So, thank you all again.